Hello, everyone. I'm joined today by Luke Kenworthy, and I think today we're going to talk in free-form fashion, not adhere to anything hard and fast, but just speak a little bit about the topic here is our experience with money, career, and the like, whether this is at college, at Harvard, where we both attended and were roommates, or in other areas of our here-to-date short-ish lives. So with that, I would love to just propose a couple of topics that I think we're going to run through. And I'd love for this to turn into as free-form and free-flowing a discussion as possible. So, Luke, the first question for you, and I would love to do this in, again, just free-flowing format. There's no rigid guidelines here. Is just to talk a little bit about what we observed when we were at college, specifically different careers that our classmates and maybe ourselves too were considering going into. The various, I like to call them cliques in college. This could be the so-called pre-med contingent, the pre-law folks, the things that I call positions of prestige, things like finance, specifically private equity and investment banking, consulting, and other pre-business tracks. Let's just kind of have this out. So, Luke, I'd like us to do an exercise here. And without naming names, let's just think of the many people that we knew at college and the kinds of people that they were and the kinds of lives that they were trying to build for themselves. And let's try to identify a number of common themes here. So I'll just lay my cards out on the table. I grew up in a family that was, I would not say rich at all, but fairly comfortable, at least from the time that I was pretty young. We took vacations. We really never wanted for anything. We didn't do anything lavish, but my parents didn't drive nice cars, but they had cars that always worked. We had plenty of presents on Christmas. We went out to restaurants to eat occasionally. We were a pretty well-off family. And to be honest, I never thought a lot about money in either direction. I didn't think a lot about being poor, but I also didn't think a lot about being super rich either. And it was a pretty humbling experience to go to college and meet people that came from either of the two opposing paths. Either they were children of the extreme rich, or they were children of families that were struggling, and in some cases, it seems barely making ends meet, so to speak. How do you think a person's background, and you're free to construe that however you'd like, you could construe that socio-economically, you could construe that culturally, religiously, or otherwise, how do you think a person's background and what they grow up observing in their family about money and career and prestige and all of those sorts of things influences the path that they decide to take, whether with their career or with their financial outlook or things of the like? How do you think that has anything to do, if at all, with how such people go on to behave once they're adults?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think how you grow up has a huge impact on who you end up becoming after, like, once you have grown up, once you've transferred from someone who's growing up to someone who has grown up. And I don't think that's a very controversial opinion. One thing you brought up how people from Harvard, where we both went to school,
just in case that wasn't already clear,
that is indeed the school that we both attended. So I like how you brought up that they come from a wide variety of backgrounds, but in both like super rich and also some like definitely people who had a pretty rough time like socioeconomically growing up. One thing I found that maybe I didn't realize while I was in college and before that, coming out of college, I now live in Colorado Springs, and I also see people who had, maybe kind of a rough upbringing, or not rough upbringing, but like grew up, more poor. But the people who end up at Harvard are, even if they came from a poor background, are very different from people who are poor and like don't end up at Harvard. Like they seem to have like very different mentalities. So I would, while Harvard definitely like strives to bring in people from a lot of different backgrounds, by nature of like having gotten into Harvard, like you're going to have a very different background than like most of America, even if you come from a poorer background.
Sure. Yep. Now I'm thinking of someone in particular that I knew, and let's not name names. Obviously, not that there's anything negative to say about this person that I'm thinking of.
Wait, hold on. I'm gonna
guess.
I'm gonna guess the person and say their name. Just kidding. Sorry.
I actually don't even think that this person, which is kind of funny because I feel like our circles kind of overlap. the majority of the time. But there's one person that I know for whom, he is the picture of a success story. Born to very humble beginnings, and by virtue of his intelligence and, to be honest, just his extreme work ethic and charm and tact and brilliance, now I haven't talked to him in a couple of months, but I would assume lives very successfully. And that person has what I really consider to be just a hungry mindset, always thinking about how to better his circumstances, thinking about, I'm sure, his family, and not just keeping his family in mind as a lesson for how to be better and to do things better than they were able to do, but also thinking in a very benevolent way about how to help them as well. And I saw that with a number of people, probably even some that you and I both knew, for whom the background was extremely humble and there was that hunger there, right? That hunger to do better than their families were able to do for any number of factors. I have something that I call the inverted U hypothesis. You picture a U and then you flip it upside down. So there's this kind of middle region that's interesting, but the outer extrema more or less behave the same way. Actually, maybe it's a U, not an inverted U. I'm not sure. But
so when you say inverted U, you actually mean U.
Yeah, I think it's actually U. I'm not sure why I tried to get cutesy with the inverted U. But yes, the U, where the children of the most humble families and the children of the most wealthy, elitist, we'll talk about that distinction in a minute, I'm sure, families really tend to have similar outcomes. I think the children, and this is just my opinion, I don't really have any data that I'm predicating this on, it's just what I saw anecdotally. The children of the most wealthy families have that same, it's not exactly hunger. And I'm not implying on the other side of the spectrum that they have things just kind of laid out for them by virtue of their birth. I think there's certainly some of that, but they know that they'll be entering prestigious, high-paying professions. Let's put aside like the artist contingent that just lives off of the trust fund and paints in Marseille for 8 years. The people that actually go on to work at places like Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, and we can talk about all of these companies that are well known in these prestigious circles in a minute, I'm sure. But the people that are entering these kinds of careers tend to be very rich. And then there's the people that have kind of the rags to riches stories that I think also by and large go on to be extremely wealthy. Now, they also benefit from programs that are intended to help people that are either first generation or low income or some combination thereof. But it's not just that, right? Like, we can't just ascribe it to people helping them out. I think they also have a very intrinsically motivated sense that they need to do better than the circumstances that they came from. It's the people in the middle, the people that were born to families that, again, are not especially remarkable. We don't have a property on Nantucket. But the people that really never wanted for anything, the people that were always quite comfortable growing up, I suspect that we feel a much greater degree of comfort entering, if not average, than career tracks that are much less impressive and much less prolific in income sense than those that tend to be entered into by people that come from either more humble or more elite backgrounds. Do you think either A, that makes sense, or B, that comports well with what you observed during your time in college? Do you think that there's kind of a union between the people that come from very elite families and people that come from the exact opposite of that in terms of how they tend to do? And then I guess a separable question from that, do you think that people that are more or less members of the genuinely middle or either upper middle or middle class growing up tend to pursue fairly, if not, unimpressive, I certainly don't want to put it that way, but people like me that kind of work average jobs and don't really have a whole lot of financial aspiration? Do you think that there's any merit to that?
So just to like clarify what you're talking about, you're talking about like I guess like on the if we're like thinking about this U, on the x-axis you have like socioeconomic, probably more like economic status growing up, and then on the y-axis you have like level of prestige of careers pursued.
Sure. Yep. So it's a great way to think about it. And then how would that curve on that plane look?
Right. And these are of people who went to Harvard.
Let's predicate it just for sampling purposes on what we saw when we were in school, and then maybe we could speculate about broader applications if need be. But let's confine it to examples that we saw and that we observed.
Yeah, because I imagine the shape would certainly not be a U. if we're talking about the population in general. But if we're talking
Oh,
about
I see. Yes, right. Absolutely. Yeah. People that have, crossed the hurdle of becoming part of what is undeniably an elite qua elite institution of learning like Harvard or Yale or Stanford or any such school.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a really tough thing to like talk about, or not like it's difficult to talk about, but it's difficult for me to kind of like form a hypothesis on this, or like even start to like reason about, because in a way, yeah, I don't like. I didn't think a lot about like the backgrounds that people came from, economically, at least when I was interacting with them in college. Like it certainly would come up.
It's probably a good thing.
But there, yeah, in yeah, to an extent, like some of the people with like a lot more money seem to maybe like keep to their own and almost have like spaces,
Sure.
one could say, or like designed for them. Um, yeah, I don't
Well,
know.
well, let me introduce a caricature, and it's exactly that. It's a caricature. Now we could, of course, say,
Okay.
"Oh, I know someone who sounds like that." You can always come up with those examples, but let's sketch a caricature of the following person. This person went to insert one of any of the following schools: Andover, Exeter, the Rye Country Day School,
Choate.
Hopkins, Choate, um, any such school, maybe on the West Coast, Harvard Westlake, Francis Parker School, any one of these schools. Think of someone who went to these schools. Now, let's suppose further that this person has an Anglo last name. Let's also suppose further that this person is someone whose parents bought them a BMW on their 16th birthday. Picture this person. And then they get into Harvard. And you also find out that not only did both of their parents go to Harvard, but they are, in the most literal sense, a genesis of Harvard because their parents met at Harvard. Okay, pick a person, if you can think of one, that has a profile close to this one. Okay, and that's the most in your face, elitist profile. Now, yes, that's
Yep.
a caricature, obviously, but such a person to me does not seem very likely, from my experience, to think to themselves, I want to work, a fairly mid-range job at a small company. That's not a startup. We've got to be careful to divorce the whole startup scene from all this. But just an established, kind of not terribly impressive company. Maybe you could think of where you grew up in a large company that's headquartered nearby, and maybe they go to work for such a company and they pull slightly more than the average salary for somebody their age when they're just getting started. Again, not there. I was one such person, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
just in my mind, this person's like I can envision them. They're doing finance or consulting.
okay. So let's open the first gate to hell and talk about what I call the tracks of prestige. To look at my notes here: finance, consulting, and pre-business. Right. So I'm not sure about you. Would you feel comfortable at all talking? You don't have to say where you grew up, but the kids that you went to high school with, I assume may have been a bit different from the ones that I went to high school with. Were
Oh
you?
yeah, so I'm
Yeah,
good talking about, yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I
sure.
grew up in like just by Seattle. My high school had, yeah, it was in like one of the richest zip codes in America. So there's that. How I was
Yep.
able to go to that high school is a story for another day, because I definitely was dissimilar from a lot of my classmates in that respect.
Just
But
one quick cut in here so that the audience
yeah,
knows. Were you someone for whom, like, given the however you want to construe this, the wealth of your family or extended family, you probably ranked below the median of that same metric for the kids that you went to high school with? Would you say that that's true?
probably, yeah.
Okay,
That'd
interesting.
be my guess. That'd be my
Yep,
guess.
yep. Anyway,
Um,
proceed.
yeah. It conceivably I could have been above, but yeah, I'm pretty sure I was below.
Gotcha.
Um, yeah, actually, interestingly, a lot of them do. It seems like are doing better than a lot of people who I hung out with in college.
Mhm.
Is it or like the fact that they didn't go to a school like Harvard? A lot of them went to University of Washington. I think about 20% of my graduating class went to the University of Washington, which is still a very good
Mhm.
school.
Sure.
Yeah, a lot of them are doing pretty well. So yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's take someone who has this kind of profile, elitist background, goes to a school like Harvard or maybe another school of its ilk, and enters into finance, consulting, pre-business. I've got to be honest with you, Luke. I didn't know what these things were. when I entered college. I didn't know what consulting was. I certainly knew the meaning of the verb to consult, but I didn't know about the industry called consulting.
I wasn't a complete moron.
Right.
Yeah.
At least I like to think so. My idea of finance was, it sounds obviously stupid, but really, if you look at the bulk of jobs in something that can be described even adjacently as finance, it's people that work in consumer banking, right? Like the people that are tellers at your community bank, or the people that are financial planners, helping people stash $500 a month into their 401k and then invest it in an index fund. And it's not terribly complex, but it's a fairly common career for people to have. I didn't even know about this whole other world of non-consumer banking, investment banking, venture capital, private equity. I began to become bombarded with terms like these as soon as I set foot onto Harvard's campus, and I didn't know what it was at all. I didn't even know who would have such a interest in these things. I didn't even understand conceptually what the jobs were. Like, how are you as a 22-year-old going to be able to advise Microsoft about its impending merger or acquisition of some company? I had no idea. Now we can talk about the, I would argue, hand waviness of these careers in a minute here. But these were kind of already on the scene when I got to college, and I was very much thrown for a loop because I I had an interest in math and I guess what I thought was economics when I was in high school. But this was like, oh, I like to, check out how my stocks are doing. So naturally, I went through the whole, high school graduation. Oh, here's the valedictorian. What are you going to be? I'm going to be an investment banking analyst. I thought I probably heard that term somewhere. It's like a kid that just hears things but doesn't exactly know what they mean and then parrots them back in, how shall we say, inappropriate times and circumstances. I was exactly that with my career track. I was like, okay, yeah, sure. Like I want to go into finance. I had no idea what that meant. Absolutely none. The first, probably the second month of college, I was in math class, and this kid that I knew that I'd gotten to be friendly with walked in the room and plops his stuff down and says, "Hey, have you thought about your summer internship?" I was like, "What the heck are you talking about? It's the first week of October. What?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm doing these interviews." I had no idea about this entire sphere of things, and yet it's so pervasive and so popular. Did you know that such things existed before you came to college? And what exposure, if any, did you have with these so-called tracks of prestige? I imagine being on the West Coast for you, it may have been more tech tinged than finance tinged. But can you speak a bit about that? If you want to say anything there?
Yeah, no, it's super interesting going into college and just seeing the types of paths that are available that I hadn't really even thought about before I had shown up there. I guess like my perception of finance going into college was probably no more advanced, or at most slightly more advanced than kind of the public's perception. Like, that you have Wolf of Wall Street, right? And people are like, oh yeah, like that's what finance is. So I think in a general sense, like I knew what finance was, but yeah, I didn't really fully perceive that this was like, there's like a whole kind of like ecosystem around like producing investment bankers from people at these types of schools. To be honest with you, I still don't fully like understand how investment banking works, how private equity, like hedge funds, how all of those work, and like what a career in one of those would look like. In fact, like even if I've considered going into finance before and thinking like, oh, that's like a career path I could pursue. But yeah, I don't even really fully know what that looks like.
Sure.
Same thing with consulting. Tech for me, because I was on the West Coast, in Seattle, lots of Microsoft, lots of Amazon presence there. And also being in the computer science department at Harvard, I knew lots of people going into those types of roles. I think I would say I'm more familiar with that. But yeah, I didn't realize like the experience you mentioned of like, oh, a few months in looking for an internship. I was also like behind the ball on that. Like I did look for an internship my first summer after freshman year. I ended up not getting one. And in fact, I never actually really got like a more prestigious internship, you could say. So like, yeah, I'm not like super up to date on these types of systems that go on. But
So
most familiar with the tech realm.
so just as I never did an internship in, Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or McKinsey or Bain or BCG, and the list goes on. Or Barclays. I didn't do an internship at any of those places. You similarly did not do an internship at any place like Netflix, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, anything in the like big tech realm, did you?
Yeah, that's correct. The closest I got was doing a startup in San Francisco, which is similar, but it's not quite the same.
Talk a bit, if you could, about startup culture, because that's also a big draw among people that we went to college with. Is it's very bifurcated. So probably if you were to look at, first 2 year after college earnings, and then make a big graph of such a thing, and then bucket it by career field that people enter into. Um, People that go into startups, I imagine it's very bifurcated. Some do very well. I'm sure some go belly up and they don't make a whole lot of money. So it's certainly not just about money here. But let's talk about something that is not guaranteed to be a high earning field, but is nonetheless, I think, tinged with an element of elitism. And that's startups. So what was your experience with working for a startup, the company culture? How would you say, not having worked at any large company, but how do you suspect that the mindset there would have differed from a large, more established tech company? What was your experience like there? If you can talk about that at all.
Yeah, for sure. Honestly, well, I guess it also just felt like a bigger tech company, but way smaller. I think it's because it was more of an established startup. Like they had like 30 or 40 people. This wasn't like 5 people sitting in a room trying to get a company off the ground.
Sure.
I mean, it paid well. It actually paid more. As I got paid more as an intern than I'm making now. Yeah, it seemed like, yeah, just software. Actually, I think to describe like their code base and like the software engineering type of stuff that went on, I actually tried to start like my own website the summer before. And like the way that their code looked was kind of like if I had started that website and like a bunch of people had piled on, like started building out that code. So it probably wasn't like as good of a like technical base. But yeah, in terms of the culture itself, it seemed, yeah, just like a small company. Like I don't know if there's anything like distinctly startup-y about it.
Let's pivot a bit and talk about envy. Because this is a big thing, obviously. Being jealous of the opportunities that other people are getting to work at big fancy companies, and maybe a lot of self-doubt about whether the track that you're on is the right one. Or, barring that, doubt about whether you even deserve to have the same success as other people do. Or maybe in the opposite direction, a feeling that you deserve it and they don't, because I think that the Ivy League is rife with this kind of thing. About people, or picture in your head people that you know that either work for really prestigious companies or did that back in college and are making a lot of money and are doing really great things, at least on a superficial level, and talk about how that makes you feel. Because I must admit that knowing early on in college, very early on, I would say, that I didn't want anything even approximating the same kind of life that my classmates were pursuing, with the big fancy jobs and industries that I didn't find to be particularly interesting. I always felt a little bit of envy, and not really the feeling that they don't deserve it and that I do, but really the feeling that I wish I could be the type of person who would enjoy working a job like this and could have all of the riches, the money, the spoils, the nice expensive dinners, the travel, all the stuff. Did you feel any consternation about the fact that people in college were maybe getting to pursue opportunities that you either chose to or weren't able to?
Oh, most certainly. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but yeah, I definitely felt like that. I think one of the feelings that stuck out for me is the fact that like a lot of people who had more of a technical background and maybe like had more experience with computer science going into college ended up getting like these more whatever desirable, prestigious like tech internships. And like the fact that I was never able to like break into that, so to speak, I think this certainly made me jealous to an extent. Like, oh, they came from this background that I wasn't able to come from, which by the way, like looking at that now is completely ridiculous, because it's like, well, we're already like at this super elite school that like lots of other people like wish they could go to or like tried to get into, but like weren't able to. And I would imagine for them, like there's probably, I mean, maybe not, but like uh, there's there's always like something higher, like your jealousy.
Sure.
There's always an opportunity to be jealous, like no matter where you are. What was that like for you, Joseph? I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
I would say that for me, the feeling was not a visceral feeling of, envy or greed, but just an overall sense of confusion. I couldn't understand how these people all had it figured out. I really couldn't. And I tried to ascribe it to a number of things. Like the person that I know who, waltzes into college and then gets the internship at Goldman Sachs or whatever. I tried to figure out what was it about them. And I cycled through a number of theories that I thought could explain why they were having so much success. So I thought to myself, are they better connected than I am by virtue of their pre-college life? Let's not forget there's 18 years that go by before you even set foot on a college campus. So that's got to count for something. Um, did they have connections from high school, from their parents, which is a big one, not to be ignored, from older siblings? Did they have connections, not at a specific company, but just through a general kind of locus of prestige? For instance, they grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, or they grew up in Pacific Palisades, California, or they grew up in, pick endless examples. They grew up in Brooklyn, Florida. I don't know, just a really wealthy suburb of a nice city. And I kind of cycled through it in my mind. And what I realized at the end of it, this sounds like a cheap cop out, but I realized that they just had a passion for it that I was unable to replicate. And the reason for that is it's very hard to pursue something and be good at it if you hate it. And I would see these jobs, and I actually had an internship in the, broadly speaking, the investment banking field when I was summer in between junior and senior year. And I expected to go in and do lots of really interesting things, and my advice would be called on, and I would be giving counsel, and I could do really sophisticated math, to be able to figure out how much to pay to, whatever, acquire this company. And what I found was these jobs, at least at the beginning, are bodies, and that's pretty much where it starts and ends. It's knowing how to do Excel. It's knowing how to proofread code on the other side of the equation. It's knowing how to make very aesthetically pleasing PowerPoints. And I realized I couldn't do something like this, that I found to be just completely, I don't mean to impugn the field, pretty intellectually vapid. And I think there's a lot of first year analysts that would describe what they do as vapid and not exciting. Now, there's the classic concept of paying your dues and moving up the ranks, and then you get to do more interesting things. But I just realized that these people were intrinsically motivated, where I was trying to extrinsically motivate myself. They wanted, I don't think they just wanted money. I think they wanted stability. I think they wanted prestige. I also think they wanted money. I think they wanted to please their parents. I think they wanted to do what their buddies in the crew team were doing. I think it was a variety of factors. I didn't have any of these things in college. And I just figured out I couldn't motivate myself to do something that I had absolutely no interest in doing. That I think explains a lot of how I felt on the finance side. For tech, for me, it's a very interesting relationship. I really wish, in retrospect, that I had come into college wanting to do comp sci, because I think there's a lot more lift with that kind of career track than there is with doing what I did, which is studying econ and math. I think people that are in tech are able to pull off a very prestigious, a very comfortable life, but not suffer from some of the pitfalls, the so-called sins of excess that people that are in the finance or consulting realm do. And that's to say, I picture a really successful comp sci grad working for Amazon as someone that goes into the office at 8 and leaves at 5:30 and pulls 230 G's a year and goes back to their apartment in the Presidio in San Francisco and has a good time of it. I picture people that are in investment banking as extremely miserable, overworked people that are unable even to find time to spend all the money that they make. So I would say I had like a certain feeling of envy for finance that was very different from the envy that I had for tech. For finance, I thought, I wish I could find this interesting, because then I could do it and make a lot of money and not be miserable. And I also thought, I frankly wish I had the work ethic that would enable me to work 80 hours a week and not complain about it. But I absolutely don't have that ethic, and I'm convinced that I never will. For tech, I just wish that I knew how to code, is basically what it came down to. So it's a much more simpler kind of envy for tech, and I probably a much more complex kind of envy for finance.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think like on my end of thing, this is like slightly related, I guess, on the tech front. I think what I didn't like, to me, there's a difference between software engineering and like what I find interesting about computer science, because I really do like computer science and I like what I studied in college. But I don't like, or at least right now, I think I don't like the career that's commonly associated with computer science, namely software engineering, meaning like writing code for some company to build out like their product. And I think the reason why is that, like, I think when you're writing code, you're kind of just doing a bunch of things that have already been done. Whereas what I have found to be super interesting is like doing technical research, which is like you're trying to actually find new things. The problem, and from like a practical stance, though it's certainly not overcomable, is like there's a big difference in pay between people who do software engineering and people who go into research. Just look at grad student salaries.
Sure, very true. I want to pivot slightly here and talk, I think, maybe less about specific examples that we saw in college and talk a bit more abstractly about really a question that I've been exploring a lot. And that's, to what extent does one have a moral obligation to earn money? And I can imagine a number of kind of thought experiments that one can generate to approach this question. So you take someone, and this person is an individual, and they make X dollars per year. Now X is going to span across a wide array, right? You can make $45,000 a year. You can make $350,000 a year. Okay. So take the same person and let's consider a variety of scenarios, either separately or all at once. This person either has children or does not have children. If they have children, they could have one child or they could have 5 children. This person could have either grown up to a poor family or grown up to a very rich family, or somewhere in between. They could be an atheist, or they could be of faith. What does each of these scenarios, and there's others as well, they're married, they're not married. Hopefully the marriage thing would precede the children, but sometimes these things don't operate in that order. To what extent does each one of these imagined scenarios have anything at all to say about one's responsibility or moral obligation to earn money? And I'll speak a bit about why I'm interested in this question. Which career you enter, and indeed the amount of money that you make even within a fixed career, likely depends on a number of things. There's obviously some element of choice. There's an equally important and arguably more dominant side of this, which is simply what you're able to do. That's not just intelligence. That could be things like ability. That could be things like tolerance of stress. This could be something like neuroticism, not defined in the Freudian sense, but as sensitivity to negative emotion. I'm extremely neurotic. And that's part of the reason that I can't work extremely long hours. I just get burned out way too quickly. So there's kind of an inborn element to this, but then there's also an element of choice. For instance, take me. I have a Harvard degree. I'm sure if I had worked a little bit harder and tried to leverage connections more, I could be working a much better paying job than I'm working right now. However, for me, I'm comfortable in saying I don't really want to be doing that. So I'm okay with how much money I make right now, even though it could probably be about 50% higher if I worked at a more prestigious company. I'm also an individual. My expenses are pretty low. I don't have a spouse. I don't have children. I don't have ailing relatives. I don't have humanitarian causes that I feel extreme pressure to support. The list goes on. So I'm comfortable making what I am. Let's complicate the calculus a little bit and say, now I have children. Okay. And suppose that they're expensive children. There's still an element of choice.
What makes them expensive children?
Oh, they like to, go to private school and buy the latest video games and all of that jazz. They're expensive kids, let's say.
Okay. All right.
Or maybe it's something less happy. Maybe they have extreme medical bills. They're born with certain illnesses that require expensive care of some sort. Okay. Now this whole choice aspect becomes a little more suspect, right? And I think as evidence of that, you need look no further than the fact that there's a world in which you chose your current career and you're unable to support your children, or you chose a harder, less enjoyable, better paying career. But in that scenario, maybe you would be able to support your children. Okay. To what extent does one's life circumstances have anything at all to say about their obligation to earn more money or their perceived blame or fault for having not entered the highest paying career that they could? I think that the answer to this question will have a lot to say about why the children of some of the least fortunate families that end up going to schools like Harvard end up doing the best. They have a fire lit under them in some sense, because they know through firsthand experience what can happen when they don't have enough money. And they've seen that from their parents and whoever else. Do you think it's any more morally suspect for somebody that has more expensive life obligations to be working a career that they enjoy, but that maybe sometimes has trouble paying the bills, or if not has trouble paying the bills, at least doesn't afford either as much room for luxury, savings, or any other positive financial thing? Do you think that there's a moral question here, or do you think that people can't be blamed for entering the careers that they do?
Well, I certainly think it's a factor, right? Like, yeah, if you if you have a kid who has like special needs that like for whatever reason is very expensive, kind of like you mentioned, uh, yeah, and you're kind of choosing to not support them in the ways that they need to be supported. Yeah, it definitely sounds like a problem. I do think it seems like often people maybe inflate, and I'm totally just saying this based on like my own feelings and own experience, but people inflate like what like providing for your kids means, right? Like I don't think it's necessarily like a bad thing for a family to struggle financially. Uh, and I guess what I mean by that is like having a little bit of struggle, having a little bit of stress. I think is fairly normal, and living through those times I think can potentially be a good experience, kind of depending on the result of it. Where I think you run into issues is like where you're actually like you can't provide food for your family, right? I'm talking like there's a difference between not being able to provide your kids with food and not being able to provide them with like the latest video games or latest like technology that comes out.
Right, right. So I guess maybe to try to summarize a bit of what you're saying, the question really shouldn't be about the room for luxury in the salary. It should be about having a moral obligation to make sure that your family is well taken care of, um, in terms of the things that are necessities of life: adequate
Yeah,
shelter, food, a safe neighborhood in which to grow up, things like that.
yeah, and I think it's a lot more complicated than that, though. And I think you're kind of touching on that a little bit, right? Like, what if by working like a more difficult job that pays more, you're able to provide them with more opportunities, like going to a private school or something like that. Like,
Yep.
it's generally not going to be like super clear cut because these things kind of just happen. But I could see like an argument being made, like if you could provide your kids more of an opportunity, but you don't, there might be some amount of like moral culpability there. It's also important to like think about, like what actually are the needs of your kids, right? Like, is the ultimate goal in life to have them grow up, like end up in the upper quintile, like the top quintile of wealth? From my perspective, being Christian and Catholic, I would say no. And like, it's most important that you provide like a solid spiritual foundation. Um, but then there's also some, in a way, I guess, like luxuries associated with that, right? Like, I guess an example that could come up is like, okay, say your kid is really into art, right? And they want to pursue like the true, the good, and the beautiful through art. But is that a luxury, or is that something that you should provide for them? It's very complicated, it seems.
Agreed. What do you think defines elitism? Like when someone says, "Oh, this person is an elitist," what do you think that means?
Oh
Or I guess
gosh.
normatively, what should such a statement mean? Like what should be classed as elitism versus non-elitism? And I'll set the stage a bit, because I don't think wealth and elitism are the same thing. Like, I don't think that because someone is rich, they're elitist, and I don't think being rich is necessary to be an elitist.
You're
But
talking about like elitism in the negative sense.
sure,
Okay.
as carefully distinguished from meritocracy. So as distinguished from the fact that people that are more capable should do better than those who aren't, or people that work harder should do better than those who don't, or something. People that have, in the negative sense, an elitist mindset toward things. Who are such people, and what do they tend to believe when you would say that someone is elitist in their thought?
Uh, in a way, I think the way you framed it probably gives like a fairly good explanation, in that, you know, as opposed to meritocracy, it seems like elitism in a very negative, in its like negative sense, properly construed, would be against meritocracy. Like, I deserve to have this opportunity simply because I went to Harvard, not because of like anything else involved, not because I like deserve it in any like way, shape, or form. Like, probably like the more egregious examples would be like, oh, me and you went to the same, we were in the same final club at Harvard. Like, yeah, you get the job. I know nothing about you. You could be like a terrible person, but I'm still going to give you this job because we have like this random like old boys club connection. That's generally what I think of with elitism. What about you?
Can you explain for the audience first what a final club is?
Oh yes, and that that's probably a little bit elitist that I just said. You know, final club. Final clubs are basically like frats for Harvard.
Well, they're frats, but they aren't, right? So like for frats, you can rush them. I've never been in a frat. But you know, you show up at the University of North Carolina in August, and you know, you can rush a frat. You don't necessarily get in, but it's, I suppose, open auditions, right? Final clubs, as I understand, are not quite like this. So like I believe there may be some that operate on that kind of model. But there's a kind of tiering structure there, right? So the most arguably elitist club is the Porcellian, which was Teddy Roosevelt's final club. Also FDR, I want to say. I think so. But world renowned, the Winklevoss twins, famously from the movie The Social Network, the people that claim to have come up with the idea that Mark Zuckerberg later stole to found Facebook, were members of this club. That one I think is like the most prestigious and most exclusive. And these are, in essence, I think it's a great example to use, what I think of as elitism. Um, you typically get tapped, or I'm not sure if they say punched,
It's
for
punched, yeah.
punched for these clubs based off of, really, it can't be thought of as anything more or less profound than just connections. Like, who do you know? Which family are you a part of? Which connections do you have to other people that are either in the club or have been in the club? Um, this has nothing to do with merit at all, and everything to do with circumstances of one's birth. And I think that's kind of the core idea that I'm trying to get at here, is when people are said to be elitist, is it that they care about things that are not the product of effort or wit or skill, but are just given to you by dint of your birth. I'm going to argue it's not quite this, because even the person that thinks that they deserve something because they went to Harvard, let's suppose that this person is not the caricature that I brought up at the beginning of the call, where they went to Exeter and, you know, their last name is, you know, Hopkinton or some other Anglo word, you know, but it's a person who, much like myself, is not legacy, has no family members that not even just didn't go to Harvard, but didn't go to the Ivy League or anything close to it. Such a person, I imagine, despite the fact that they worked hard to achieve what they have, can be said to be a bit elitist if they say things like, "Oh, I don't, you know, talk to people that didn't go to Harvard." It's not that they were born with it necessarily, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, but it's not necessarily that they were born to such a position. They did work for it. They, in some cases, probably worked very hard for what they have, but now they seem to have become, in common parlance, elitist. So what is it about the elitist character that transcends the realm of like born with it versus not born with it that makes someone elitist? Is it that they think that their accomplishments have something of what psychologists call a halo effect, like the idea that because they've succeeded at one thing, that they owe being thought of as successful in all things. So if I, go out to a bar and I talk to a young lady and she rejects my advances, then, oh, what? Come on, I went to Harvard. There's no connection between being someone that a young woman would be interested in and going to Harvard. But your mind jumps there. You're like, come on, I went to Harvard, right? That to me is elitism. It's drawing connections between perceived accomplishments and other things that are completely orthogonal to that accomplishment that you're predicating your elitist persona on. Do you think that there's any merit to that conception of elitism?
Certainly, yeah. And I think the way it resonates most with me is I think it's almost ascribing things that are out of one's control to one's own ability, right? So I guess the way I think about it, like in my own life, where I think going to a school like Harvard, I've certainly had like elitist type thoughts at times. And when those do pop up, I think the reason why is because, I was very lucky to have gotten into Harvard, right? Like if I were to have applied, 10 times, accounting for like natural randomness in the universe, I'd imagine I'd only get in like once, maybe twice. But the fact that I could get in twice is probably me overestimating my own ability.
Right.
But the point is, like, I certainly got very lucky having gotten into Harvard. And I think there were lots of like similar applicants to me who didn't get into Harvard, right?
Sure.
So the fact that I like lucked out, and granted, I worked very hard to even get into a position where I might be able to get admitted. But the fact that I did get in, the luck, to whatever extent like luck is involved there, I think elitism would be like ascribing that luck to my own ability. And I think it's very easy to talk about this with Harvard, in that like it's a very kind of concrete way that it manifests in life. But I think it happens. I think we see like a similar phenomenon in lots of other circumstances in life, right? Like someone, for example, like someone might have just like, they might just be like, have really like rough life circumstances, but who am I to say that, if I were in their circumstances, I would have done any better? To what extent is it their fault? To what extent is it not? I don't think really anyone can truly definitively say, this side of eternity.
Well,
Also,
Go
can
ahead.
I go into
Sorry.
an anecdote about final clubs?
Yes.
So FDR, this is from Wikipedia, but it's probably true, and I've seen it before. FDR tried to get into the Porcellian, but instead joined the Fly. The Porcellian and Fly are both clubs. However, FDR in his late 30s declared, perhaps hyperbolically, that not being punched by the Porcellian was the greatest disappointment of his life.
Now, so picture such a person for whom not getting invited to what is essentially a drunken orgy, which, although potentially fun, is exactly that, a drunken orgy of spoiled brats, would be the greatest disappointment. Oh, we should feel nothing but extreme pity for such a person, or perhaps great joy that such a person had such a wonderful life, that was their biggest failure. Now, it's also coming from a person who contracted polio, so one would think that the biggest disappointment in such a person's life would be contracting polio and being rendered immobile, but apparently not. It was not getting into the pork. So that's interesting. Not a huge FDR fan, as you could probably tell, for other reasons that transcend his elitism. However,
that are certainly not coming out right now.
No, certainly not. I'm very level-headed in my approach here. Let's go a step further, and let's talk about elitism as construed by inability, or perhaps mistaken imposition of one's self-concept on other people's lives. Sounds very psychological, but I'll give you a great example of this. There's someone that we both know. Genuinely a fantastic person. Genuinely one of the most intentionally down-to-earth people. Genuinely one of the most humble people ever. This person asked me, not in an accusatory tone, but was genuinely curious, which place in the country is the most popular post-college destination for people from your hometown? fairly legitimate question. Where do people that you grew up and went to high school with tend to land after college? If you knew anything about my hometown, you would immediately recognize this as a confusing question and confusedly say the one in which they grew up. My father grew up in the town that I grew up in and has lived there all of his life. My family, from the time that it got to America in the early 20th century, has lived in the same 25-mile range as each other and continues to, largely with the exception of a couple of them, until this day. That's one instance of someone who grew up in Boston and New York, not in a malicious way, but not understanding, or perhaps it did and just wanted to verify, but let's suppose that he didn't, that there's a lot more permanence in this country in terms of where one lives after the first 22 years of their life than perhaps one would think, having grown up in a place where people went to schools like Harvard as a regular occurrence and went to several people in high school that ended up becoming classmates of his, not just in high school, but also at Harvard as well. There's other things as well. The most striking example to me is the so-called opioid epidemic, opiate epidemic, that's particularly prominent in the Midwest and Appalachia. And I've heard it said repeatedly, and I confess have thought this to myself a time or two. Why don't these people just stop doing heroin? Pretty simple, right? Just don't do heroin and then you won't become addicted to it. But this neglects to consider, in some cases, the abject poverty, misery, family destruction that may drive someone to become addicted to narcotics. Also, I confess, a personal form of elitism. Seemingly obvious answer to why people may be induced to do drugs and become addicted to them. But I, having grown up in a stable family that was not ravaged by drug addiction, growing up in a community that by and large was not ravaged by drug addiction, couldn't understand, at least at first blush, why this would be such a problem. I think the core of elitism is a lack of self, or a lack of the a lack of ability to restrain oneself from imposing their own personal experiences on others. Right? It's the same example that I think ties together the example of my friend not realizing that it was kind of a funny question to be asking, where do people tend to go after they grow up in my town in southwestern Connecticut, not realizing that the answer is the exact same town in southwestern Connecticut and probably live with their parents for a while after that too. Or the person like myself that doesn't understand why heroin is such a problem, or the person who doesn't understand why people can't have access to the same opportunities that he or she did. In a sense, there's kind of a false meritocracy here, if you will. And that's why I ask about the question about the moral obligation to earn more. Because I think there's a lack of understanding about the constraints that are placed almost innately on people for who they can be and what they can do. And as progressive and liberal as a society, and certainly as a community, as I think Harvard was, they miss the fundamental point here, which is some people are constrained by dint of birth, family, circumstances outside of their control, etc. So I think the core of elitism is the inability to understand where the limits of imposing one's self-concept on others begin.
So
and
I have,
end.
I have a question about that. If that's your definition of elitism, is that not a human phenomenon that is not restricted to people who, say have higher socioeconomic status, right?
It's absolutely a human phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess to give like an example where I could see this going the other way around is, say, someone wants to, go to graduate school, right? And then they're talking to someone who maybe just did high school, never went to college, and that person's like, oh, well, why would you want to like go to more school? Or like, why would you do that, even if it's not going to like necessarily give you a higher paying career, right? So to me, like, I guess the way you're describing it is almost like a lack of empathy, right? Or like lack of ability to kind of see beyond one's own self view. But that I could see an argument being made for that being like worse from a moral standpoint when, people who are higher up in society,
right,
for lack of a better term, are unable to understand the perspective of those who are like lower in society socioeconomically. I could see
Right.
that being like morally worse than it going the other way around. But fundamentally, like it seems like a problem that is not exclusively tied to people of higher socioeconomic status.
So I think that you're exactly right there. And I think there's the same underlying problem, which is human and probably practiced to some degree by everybody who has ever lived. Which is again this lack of understanding about the extent to which your experience can be superimposed upon either subjectively or otherwise on the influences or on the profile, let's say, of someone else and what you think they should be doing with their life and so on and so forth. I think that's the same fundamental human impulse, but we call it elitism when it dwells in what I call the positions of prestige, the Ivy League, the investment banks, the big consultancies, big tech, any such thing, right?
Government.
That's sure defense contracting. That's where it bleeds into elitism because it's arguably more suspect when it's being practiced by people that are in the positions of prestige. And again, all of this is completely separable, completely orthogonal to the issue of merit or perceived accomplishment. I think the elitist mindset has to do with where you are now, not at all the steps that you have to take to get here. Whether I have $10 million because I slaved away at it for 20 years, or whether my parents gave it to me in a trust, I think sets me up for elitist tendencies. Now, you could argue that one of these probably disposes you to that attitude more than others, right? Like probably the person that had it dropped in their lap has less empathy because they don't know what it's like to struggle to get that money. But a lot of this is, again, not just elitism predicated on circumstances of birth, but elitism predicated on perceived ability for others in different situations to replicate the accomplishments that you had.
Mm-hmm.
I, on the side, advise kids, high school seniors that are looking to get into good colleges. And one thing that I've always found very uncomfortable about doing that is there's a very plausible world in which I couldn't be doing this because I didn't go to Harvard, because I didn't get in. And to see that, you just have to look no further than the fact that Harvard can admit, that is, they have more than 1,600 applicants, an entire class of people that had perfect SAT or ACT scores. So I did not have a perfect SAT score. Cards on the table. And therefore, there are people who, by a meritocratic conception, again, if you want to say that standardized tests are the end all be all, at least under that criterion, should have gotten in before I got in. Okay. It would be a very elitist thing for me to say, oh, you're not getting into Harvard is evidence of your apathy or lack of work ethic, or you just had to do what I did, but you couldn't even do it, or the big elephant in the room that's completely verboten to say nowadays, but I'll just bring it up anyhow. People vary tremendously according to how intelligent they are. And most of that is heritable. So, like, sorry, but just like I'm not going to be the next Michael Jordan, some other kid is not going to be the next Einstein, right? Like, I was born with, I would argue, sports and athletic talent that lands me very squarely in the bottom decile of people. I don't see that as a positive or a negative. I just think that's what it is. I think there's also people for whom their innate intelligence would rank them in the bottom decile, because if there's 100 percentiles, then there's got to be 10 of them that are at the bottom, right? And that's just kind of how it is. So all of this, even if it's innate or earned, ignores the fact that my circumstance is not perfectly replicable if someone else were to do it. And even my own experience, if repeated the exact same way, may have culminated in a result very different from the one that I actually ended up experiencing just due to chance. So I think, yes, same phenomenon, but I think when it dwells in the positions of prestige, that I call them, then it crosses the line into elitism. That's one of many, I think, possible conceptions of the term.
Yeah, and I kind of going to my point, like a difference between like just general lack of empathy, general lack of being able to understand the perspectives of others, and like elitism. Like it certainly makes sense that that same lack of empathy in people who are in higher like socioeconomic positions is worse because in a lot of ways they control lots of aspects of society that end up affecting those like in the bottom. The most like explicit example would be like Congress, right? Because they set laws that affect all of America, right? But kind of this happens probably more implicitly with, you know, people who have a lot of wealth, right?
Sure.
So
Sure.
I think it does make sense from that perspective to almost give it greater moral gravity when it goes one way and not the other.
Yep. The last topic I'd like to talk about here, and I'll tell a short story before I launch into this one, is on the topic of anti-elitism. So we've already talked about elitism and our experiences with it and possible definitions for it and the dangers of elitism. I'd love to talk now about anti-elitism and the merits or negatives of exactly that kind of thing. Okay, so I'll tell a quick story. So I've thought a lot throughout the years about how I think about pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical companies. And here's the best description that I have landed on for how I feel about them. I'm not pro-pharmaceutical. I'm not anti-pharmaceutical, but I am anti-pharmaceutical. In other words, I don't love the idea of giving amphetamines to 4-year-old boys because they can't sit still in class because they're 4-year-old boys. But I also don't love the idea of, you know, a weird Earth Day celebrating Berkeley, California dwelling individual, you know, saying that their kid can't have insulin because that's not natural and they only put natural things in their kids' bodies, not drugs that were made by for-profit companies. You can obviously see the idiocy of both sides, right? You shouldn't be pumping people full of drugs that they don't need, but you also shouldn't be denying life-saving treatment to people that can actually access it. Okay, pick endless examples, right? Maybe on one side you have like the San Francisco contingent that wants their kids to go to Stanford, so they give them Ritalin when they're 4 years old, and then maybe on the other side you have, you know, Christian scientists whose children are dying of cancer and they don't give them chemotherapy. So I have disdain for both of these perspectives. Let's do a similar rendition of elitism versus anti-elitism. Here's where I think I've landed. I'm not pro-elitist, I'm not anti-elitist, but I am anti-elitist. In other words, I think there's a tendency to see success, wealth, positive life circumstances, and immediately ascribe this to elitism. You know, tax the rich, down with corporations. Corporations are a cancer. You know, like there's an idiocy to both sides, right? It's idiotic to go to Harvard and then assume that everybody else is an idiot because they didn't go to Harvard. I think it's also stupid to yell at people that are going to the Ivy League and call them sellouts and traitors simply because they want to work hard and have a better life than their parents were able to give them. Do you think that there's any merit to this idea of being neither pro nor anti, but anti-anti?
Oh, most definitely. One of the examples that comes to mind is, you know, often I'll hear people say like, "Oh, this person has a PhD, like therefore he's a complete idiot," or like he thinks he's smart just because he has some certificate on a piece of paper. It's
And
like,
can I just cut in very
yeah,
quickly? There is a danger when this becomes politically tinged too. So now that the right wing in America, for instance, sees the left wing as occupying, among other things, academia, large corporations, the positions of prestige, the Greenwich, Connecticut's, and the Pacific Palisades, Californias of the world, there's a danger to immediately reduce themselves to just jealous crybabies by saying, "Oh, you have a PhD. I'm going to completely invert it now. Not only are you not as intelligent as people may think you are, which may be true. Having a degree doesn't necessarily mean that you know, have an IQ that's 50 points above people of you know, other people. But now to completely invert it such that you're the moron. You know, actually, haha, you're the idiot. Not just an idiot with a PhD. You're an idiot because you got the PhD, and the fact that you have a PhD tells me that you're a moron. A complete inversion of truth, a complete inversion of reality that is caused by the so-called elitism, being more, at least in a certain side's perception, more to be found in one political party than the other. Just wanted to cut in there. There's a real danger of that happening, and that's happening right now on the American right wing. Go ahead.
Yeah, basically, I think you captured a lot. Like, oh, this person, like, clearly this person has a PhD, therefore, like, they're an idiot, right? Because if you go to school for 5 additional years studying this thing, that's going to make you a complete idiot. Like,
Right.
I think that's completely nonsensical. Where I do think they have a point, or like where that sentiment has a point, and the people who express it have a point, uh, would be like, just because you've studied one thing very in depth does not necessarily mean that you're an expert in all things.
It's absolutely true.
But when it's applied like more broadly, yeah, I don't think that makes sense.
No. I completely agree there. One other danger, I think, of so-called anti-elitism is the destruction of the actual meritocracy, right? And to understand this, you need to understand the distinction between elitism and merit, right? So people can be elitist regardless of whether they're talented or smart, right? Picture the ne'er-do-well son or daughter of a rich couple that has a trust fund. This person can be perfectly elitist and judgmental about the fact that her friend doesn't drive a BMW, while herself having an IQ of 85. So it has nothing to do with intelligence. It may be correlated, but it's not logically related in any meaningful sense to how smart you are or how much you've accomplished. It's just the position that you find yourself in. So to understand that for a minute, by being anti-elitist, you run the danger of completely obliterating the locus of people that actually do know what they're doing through hard work, through studying, and are doing positive things for society and people by calling them elitists and saying that they need to be scrubbed from the face of the earth. The most striking example of this is what happened in the first roughly 2 decades of communism, either in the Soviet Union or in China, where respectively Stalin and Mao just took talented farmers, declared them part of the bourgeoisie, and either killed them or stole their farms, and in most cases, both. So you took the people that knew how to farm and killed them, and then you gave their land to people that had never farmed before and were then confused when your country descended into famine. And that should have been obvious, but maybe not to you because you predicated it all on this binary division, completely artificial, between the so-called proletariat and the so-called bourgeoisie, and you kind of played yourself, as the saying goes, right? I think you run a similar danger here. It's impossible to distinguish if you're anti-PhD, for instance, between people who are nuclear physicists from MIT and have the potential to completely revolutionize our energy sources and give us clean, sustainable energy in perpetuity from, yes, actual true political radicals who also have PhDs and want to destroy the country. Saying that these are the same thing is foolish. You're taking one characteristic that they both share and extrapolating that out. Now, ordinarily, we denounce this kind of prejudice, right? Hating somebody because they're a member of a particular race, religion, whatever, we all acknowledge is terrible. But somehow, when it's another attribute, like holding a certain degree, now this is not so verboten, and it's okay to mock them. So really, if I can summarize the dangers of anti-elitism, it's the inability to distinguish between who is elitist but not meritocratic and who is meritocratic but also happens to occupy a position of prestige that you ascribe the term elitist to and therefore want to be done with them. Again, think of endless examples on both the right and the left wing. The left wing example, maybe, tax the rich, down with the billionaires, down with the corporations, screw them all. Idiotic, clearly, if you thought about it for 5 seconds. On the other side, the Tucker Carlson contingent, down with the PhDs. The PhDs are idiot. Oh, you went to Harvard, you must be a moron. Equally stupid for other reasons. Do you agree with this, or do you want to pick a hole in any of that?
No, I think you actually expressed kind of what I was thinking. Like, yeah, it ignores a lot of nuance on both sides. And I think that at least part of the solution, not like I'm going to solve this problem. In fact, that would be very elitist to think that I could personally solve this
Hubris,
problem.
right? Very elitist, right?
But yeah, I think there's a lot of like looking down on the other side from both sides. And I'm not, granted, people say this a lot in terms of like the political spectrum, but here maybe I'm talking more about like the elitist, like in not elitist spectrum, right? So like people who come like end up in like, yeah, positions of power, right? Like looking down on those who are not in those positions of power, right? I think that is a bad thing. And even that looking down ignores a lot of nuance. And similarly, in the anti-elitist camp, you have the looking down on go like the other way. And actually, this is a lesson that I like learned from like while I was at Harvard, being around so many people who were just like very smart, very intelligent, who I felt like I could never compete with. My natural, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, my natural like reaction was to be envious, right? To like kind of poke holes in them and like find ways to look down on them, like, oh, this person's really successful in like this one way, but they probably suck in this other way, and I'm like way better than them because I'm better than them in this other way. Where I found I actually improved a lot was when I, rather than looking down, looked up at these people and say like, wow, this person has these cool traits, and like I wish I could be more like them in these ways. Now, it's very unlikely that you'll find someone who's like better than you in every way possible, right? So you don't want to aspire to be like them in all ways. But I think personally, I found this to be more difficult with some people than others. But I think like a helpful thing is to, for both sides, like find good things about the other side and say like, I want to be like, I can learn something from this person. And I think, yeah, that knowledge and like that mutual lifting up can go both ways. I think people from better, like higher socioeconomic backgrounds can learn a lot from those who are not as fortunate as them and don't end up in those positions, and likewise, the other way around.
Right. And in the other way around, the key insight I think that people have when they travel the world to truly destitute countries where people are truly unfortunate, and not that they don't have Netflix, but like actual things, that they don't have food, for instance, they don't have clean water, they don't have suitable shelter, is that despite their lack of wealth, despite their being squarely in a non-elitist position, that they actually do have many things that transcend the material to teach spoiled Americans about things like family, or showing kindness to strangers, or the importance of maintaining close relationships with people, not just with material things, right? So these are completely adjacent topics that I think are unfortunately lumped in together, and not without good reason. I mean, there's been all sorts of attempts for people to justify their prestige and wealth on various things. Again, I'm smarter than you. I worked harder than you. I got where I am through blood, sweat, and tears, ignoring the fact that, like, for instance, my grandfather, who was a mechanic, there was no chance in hell that the guy was going to go to Harvard. He just wasn't born into that kind of life. So he did his best, and he worked a very long number of hours every week to provide for his 4 children, and did a bang up job of it. And I owe him a lot of thanks for his sacrifice. But I certainly don't look down on him and say, see, if he had just gone to Harvard, then, he could have set my family up so much better. Obviously didn't work that way, right? And it would be foolish to assume that it would for anybody. All right, well, Luke, this has been a great conversation. I certainly don't want to take up any more of your time, but really appreciate you joining for this, I suppose, first episode of your and I and mine and whoever else's chit chats about various things on my mind, which oftentimes don't make much sense. But I hope that this one did. Do you have anything to say before we close out?
Yeah, I guess just final thought, kind of going off of what you were saying, is just like both sides, I think, should strive to like look up to each other in various ways. I think a huge danger is that there will be like no intermixing, right? And I think the worst thing that could happen is like if we both kind of like separate into our own camps and don't find those opportunities to look up to each other, because then I think that's like very dangerous for society, and those opportunities for bringing each other up can't happen. But I think that's a very real tendency when you see people who aren't like you to want to not be around them. So
yep. Well
that's
said.
my final thought. But yeah, no, this was awesome. Thank you so much for having a great conversation. This is good.
Likewise, Luke. Thanks to you all, and hope to see you on the next one.